Good evening. I'm so pleased that everyone has done the hard work for me, because what I'll try to do is talk about cities and stations and how space syntax brings an understanding of the structure of cities that allows unlocking this movement potential in stations that is sometimes problematic. So it's about the embeddedness of the stations within the city network. So, as we've seen before, high levels of movement are the great advantage, but they're also the great challenge. So therefore, the opportunity is to make stations central. And this is where the real value of having an evidence-based approach comes as a central tool, because it's not about creating centers which have a hierarchy. It's about understanding that places through the network create its own centrality, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then I'm going to show one case study, which is Waterloo Opportunity Area. It's Elizabeth House, as Camilla was explaining. But again, in that project, as well as looking at the development side, we actually had to go wider to understand what the context was. You're familiar with London, but what we then do is understand that the city is made of the places that connect to each other. And once you have that understanding, you begin to look at the emerging network. And what you'll see in a lot of the diagrams is this color coding through red for the high movement potential, through the blue spectrum of low movement potential. And this is only looking at the network, at the street connectivity. It has no movement itself embedded into the model, but it actually helps understand and predict movement. So it's a very useful diagnostic tool. What you then do is layer on stations. And as we've heard from Paul just before, the challenge of the stations is, yes, they bring movement, but they bring infrastructure to it. So what we call this thing of stations is negative attractors. You have a lot of movement, but then you have a lot of barriers around the infrastructure that you require for movement, for the station. Particularly when you're talking about railway infrastructure, thing that impedes movement, although you have archers, but simply in terms of the landmass and the boundary required by the station, you're already taking a lot of that movement. The other thing to look at is, unsurprisingly, stations are already quite central. So that they're within the key network of spaces in the city. So even though they're not in the center, although the underground then follows that, they're on the main spines leading into London. And again, the same image, sort of taking the background out. And you'll see most of the northern stations along the Marylebone and Euston Road, Victoria Station, Waterloo, which will come in a moment, and then some other stations that come into central locations, Liverpool Street, which I'll talk a little bit more in a moment. This is another diagram which looks at the permeability pattern. Again, red are small walkable environments. Blue are big blocks, take you longer to walk around. And what you'll begin seeing is obviously the problem of, while on the one hand you're next to an integrated accessible road, you're creating local segregation. Euston, King's Cross to a varied degree, Marylebone, Paddington, and so on, Waterloo Station. Fenchurch Street is an interesting one because it's well embedded, so there's something to say about almost invisible transport infrastructure. And Liverpool Street Station, where the embeddedness allows it to be part of the city. And about 30% of movement that goes through the station is actually through movement. It's not transport-oriented movement. So that's the kind of principle that we're trying to look when we're integrating transport infrastructure to city infrastructure. It's the grid that allows the potential of that movement to become an opportunity. Numbers. And this is today, 2012, 100 million passengers coming out of Waterloo Station. and it, it trails off. And what I've done in this chart is combine the London graph with the top national railway infrastructure. New Street in Birmingham, Glasgow, Leeds, ranking 8 on their own, become 19 when you take the local underground stations. So underground movement in London is higher than New Street to a degree. So, the first London underground station, Oxford Circus, what else? What is the other underground station? Piccadilly. So, the size of the problem in terms of movement is there, and the opportunities to integrate this, although you could say that they're already integrated. So there's this mismatch that we then have to then look at the local opportunities of the design, as Sandy was telling a moment ago. The numbers get even higher when you bring Crossrail. The numbers in blue for 3 stations from Bond Street are 86 million once you bring in Crossrail, 102 million if you then take the revised version that has been circulated by Arab Transport. So again, at the moment we're sort of struggling with the public realm of Waterloo. We then have to then handle the same amount of movement through a number of Crossrail stations within central London. How do we do that? So I'll show Waterloo Station and Elizabeth House. Elizabeth House is this building and site in here, but we're now looking at the whole of the station in terms of the strategic opportunities. And the process that we go in the office is first creating a diagnostic, understanding what's there in terms of movement. And I'll go back simply to show the area, as other areas of London, has dramatically changed. The South Bank completely transformed over the last 15 years. Cultural institutions, not least the Tate, and the whole embankment has now come into its own. And yet, what you have in terms of movement is, again, 100 million passengers per year that immediately disappear from the area. So you have an unbalanced pedestrian distribution both during the weekday, although you do have a little bit of movement on the network of commuters leaving Waterloo Station, walking to the city, so quite a lot of distance to go there. But the rest of it struggling. Lower Marsh, as we all are familiar with, again, struggling because it doesn't have the movement potential. The picture is made worse during the weekend, where the Queen's Walk becomes an attractor into its own, drawing a lot of movement from the station and from the North Bank, and the rest of the network doesn't deliver any movement, and it's not beneficial for anyone. Again, back to Lower Marsh. So that's one thing. The next one is to explain, so why is this happening? And here we go back at the analysis, again, of the network. It's a strategic location in terms of the city, very easily accessible if you're moving long distances. You have the connectivity. This is vehicular connectivity. You have the connectivity of Waterloo Bridge, Blackfriars, and so on, making it absolutely central. But what you also see is the lack of embeddedness, so that the centrality is almost at a local level non-existent. A quick diagnostic saying, well, you have the lines moving in, but they somehow fail to compose themselves into the center. You could argue that it's a consequence of planning and the idea of a vehicular-dominated urban plan as the roundabouts that were supposed to take us around London on the Abercrombie plans. And again, that is on top of the blockage of the station. A very, in a sense, relative simple strategy, which was simply about intensifying the grid and intensifying the connection of the large-scale centrality with the local centers, the local connections, improving almost the doorstep of the station. And that in itself will allow the emergence of new urban nodes. The important thing to say here about multi-scale centrality is that it's not a hierarchical thing. It's not that you have a center that behaves at the citywide level and another one that behaves at the local level. There's different segments that behave differently at different scales. If you're walking in a neighborhood center, a residential center, or if you're talking about the city of London as a whole, of London as a whole. Another diagram, and this begins to illustrate the usefulness of having an approach that you can test. And I'm going to flip back and forth of devising a strategy that allows us to bring the station concourse into the city or bring the city into the concourse. And it was simply by unlocking the potential that's already there, the concourse, the Milk Passage, which is through the arches, and the back of Elizabeth House. Again, simply diagrammatically, this is always, as has been explained before, a multi-headed sort of solution team, and we were working with the client, which was Chelsfield, with David Chipperfield and with Hopkins in developing sort of the specificity of the deliverable. But you can simply say, at a very sort of diagrammatic element, the connectivity that needs to be there was almost only needed to be unlocked. And again, a similar image to what Camilla did, which was about also, while we're taking the city into the station, you need to also work in the public realm, something that has been well said before. And a lot of it has to do with transforming what could be potential conflicts with solutions. And what this is we did a set of studies understanding the massive amount of people that came out through the station, cyclists leaving Waterloo Station, and then high levels of bus movement as well as taxis. And the concern was, it's a complete mess, it's a risk, we need to plan and separate them. And what we found out is that it almost worked like a shared surface approach, despite the barriers to movement. And actually it was the barriers that tried to control the space that were creating the problem. So you have these railings here that I hope you can see. People are actually walking over the railings, walking on the pavement because of the desire lines. So in a sense, what the argument was that you can have a space that gets rid of the infrastructure that separates pedestrians and vehicles, provided you then take into account pedestrian desire lines. And we do that, again, by a lot of testing and what we like to think of designing for movement. So you create the structure of the layout, you then put land use along it, but then you have to design the two together. And again, a heat map informing where the movement will be. And this was done at the technical level for the transport assessment in the AA as well. To finish up, I think this will now be familiar to everyone. It's about embedding the stations into the urban grid. The idea that if we do that, stations can become centers, but they don't become centers simply because they're stations. And in order to do that and to understand how they can become embedded, we need to understand the city in its geometrical and configurational properties. Thank you.